Does racism really infect just about every part of our society, in ways that we don't even realize? On November 15, 2021, President Biden signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill into law. This bill authorizes spending $350 billion on highway programs, and hundreds of billions more for other transportation needs. One notable aspect of this bill is that, for the first time, the federal government will spend money to combat the effects of racism in transportation planning. Is racism really embedded even into our transportation system? The Biden administration certainly thinks so.
I'm still surprised that some people were surprised when I pointed to the fact that if a highway was built for the purpose of dividing a white and a black neighborhood, or if an underpass was constructed such that a bus carrying mostly black and Puerto Rican kids to a beach, or that would have been, in New York was designed too low for it to pass by, that obviously reflects racism that went into those design choices. I don't think we have anything to lose by confronting that simple reality, and I think we have everything to gain by acknowledging it and then dealing with it, which is why the Reconnecting Communities, that $1 billion, is something we want to get to work right away putting to work.
But conservatives, such as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, disagree that it's even possible for transportation to be racist.
You know, I have to look at that. I mean, I heard some weird stuff from the Secretary of Transportation trying to, make this about social issues, and to me, a road's a road.
So who's right? Quite simply, it's the Biden administration. There is overwhelming evidence that racism has indeed influenced many significant transportation planning decisions. While the federal government provided 90% of the financing for highway construction, it left most major decisions regarding highway planning up to state and local transportation officials. The interstate highway system was formally initiated in 1956. This was only 2 years after the Supreme Court had decided Brown v. Board of Education, and 8 years before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Many state and local governments, especially in the South, were controlled by white, openly racist officials. Decisions with racial implications were made from the very start. In 1955, the U.S. Bureau of Public Roads issued a report that contained a map for the proposed interstate highway system. The original map focused mainly on commerce, and the highways avoided going through the center of urban areas, remaining on the periphery. But when the system was formally adopted the following year, the highways were now planned to go directly through downtown areas. While this design did have certain advantages, it also meant that many historic African American and minority neighborhoods were targeted for destruction. And this wasn't just an accident. It was intentional. Shortly after Congress first authorized the interstate highway system in 1956, one of the nation's most popular magazines, the Saturday Evening Post, wrote that, "A happy byproduct of all these expressway developments is that they invariably do an excellent job of slum clearance as they knife through the poorer sections of the city." Robert Moses was the leading highway designer of his day, and he had tremendous influence on which interstate projects were designed and built. In a 1959 speech, Moses said, "Our categorical imperative is action to clear the slums. We can't let minorities dictate that this century-old chore will be put off for another generation or finally abandoned." But only Moses and his allies would determine what qualified as a slum, and they often included thriving African American neighborhoods. For example, right next to the historic French Quarter in New Orleans sits the Treme, an African American neighborhood rich in history. Running through the center of the neighborhood was Claiborne Avenue, a broad thoroughfare with many charming homes and businesses. According to the Smithsonian, by the 1950s, Claiborne Avenue was the central street of the city's black neighborhoods. It contained homes, theaters, bars, and restaurants, as well as hundreds of beautiful oak trees. Many famed musicians played there, and it was the home of Black Mardi Gras. It's so significant that famed producer David Simon made a TV series about it.
Down in the Treme, it's me and my baby. We're all going crazy, bug jumping and having fun.
But the entire nature of the neighborhood was transformed when Interstate 10 was built in the late 1960s. New Orleans officials originally considered two plans for Interstate 10. One would have gone through the French Quarter, a mostly white neighborhood. The other plan ran through the Treme. At the time, no public hearings were required before building public works projects, and therefore most people in the Treme were not even aware that their neighborhood was being considered. Meanwhile, white boosters of the French Quarter were donating money to politicians and working behind the scene to make sure their neighborhood would be spared. Interstate 10 was constructed as an elevated highway running directly over Claiborne Avenue. The street itself still exists, but hundreds of trees were uprooted, hundreds of homes and dozens of businesses were demolished, including local institutions such as Fat Man's Restaurant and the Nightcap Lounge. Today, dozens of ugly, massive concrete support beams now divide the neighborhood in half. And this isn't an isolated case. Numerous examples can be found in cities all across the country, not just in the South. The twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul were, and are, overwhelmingly white. But in the 1950s, there was a small but thriving African American community nestled between them. It was called the Rondo neighborhood because it was centered along Rondo Street. Rondo Street was a hub of African American life and culture in Minnesota, with businesses of all kinds that allowed black citizens to meet and socialize. By the 1950s, 85% of St. Paul's African American residents lived in the Rondo neighborhood. But it was split in half in the 1960s when Interstate 94 was constructed just parallel to Rondo Street. Homes were now separated from businesses by a 6-lane highway. The entire nature of the area was transformed. And the list goes on and on. Overton was an African American community near Miami, Florida that was known as the Harlem of the South because of all the black artists and intellectuals that flocked there, including Josephine Baker and Billie Holiday. 20 square blocks were utterly destroyed to make room for a highway interchange, with 10,000 residents displaced. Black Bottom in Detroit was an African American neighborhood centered on Hastings Street. Ella Fitzgerald frequently performed there, but it no longer exists, due to the construction of Interstate 75 and Interstate 375. Interstate 75 also resulted in the forced relocation of 25,000 residents of Cincinnati's mostly African American West End. African American communities in many other cities were damaged or demolished, including Syracuse, Pittsburgh, Oakland, Houston, Chicago, Nashville, New York, and Baltimore. The U.S. Department of Transportation has estimated more than 1 million people were displaced during the construction of the system. These projects devastated the African American economy and cultural life of more than a dozen cities. Author Ginger Strand argues that the effects may have been far more sinister. In her book, Killer on the Road, Strand argues that the damage done to black neighborhoods due to the construction of Interstate 75 in Atlanta fostered an environment of economic depression and chaos that allowed a serial killer to kill at least 28 people, mostly young African American boys, in the Atlanta area between 1979 and 1981. While her thesis is hotly debated, the economic damage caused to African American communities by highway construction is well documented. Sometimes, transportation planning decisions were even made to punish specific African American civil rights leaders for their activities. For example, Alabama officials had 3 options when deciding where to build Interstate 85 in the city of Montgomery. One of those options would have gone through a park and would have resulted in minimal displacement of residents. However, the director of the Alabama Highway Department at the time was Sam Engelhardt. Engelhardt was an avowed racist and segregationist. His business cards had, "I stand for white supremacy and segregation," printed on the back. When he had run for lieutenant governor, his slogan was, "Segregation every day in every way." In his private papers and letters, Engelhardt expressed his hatred for famed civil rights leader Ralph Abernathy, who lived in Montgomery. It should therefore be no surprise that, rather than choosing the route through the park, Engelhardt's highway department chose a route that devastated an African American community, and which caused Abernathy's home to be demolished. Other, more fundamental features of our transportation system have racial implications as well. For example, minorities typically make up a larger percentage of urban residents than suburban or rural residents. As a result, minorities are more likely to use public transportation than white residents. However, the federal government pays for 90% of the cost of construction of the interstate highway system, but only 80% of the cost of construction of public transportation projects. The vast network of free highways also encouraged white flight from urban areas to the suburbs by making commuting less expensive. In addition, many cities invest large amounts of money in light rail and other expensive public transportation options designed for the benefit of suburban commuters, while underinvesting in bus and other transportation options for urban residents. Bus riders in both Los Angeles and Oakland filed lawsuits against their local transportation agencies for underfunding bus service, while pouring millions into light rail. The lawsuit was successful in obtaining more bus funding in Los Angeles, but it failed in Oakland. Furthermore, transportation services in suburban areas often have nice facilities and more frequent stops and service than transportation in urban ones. For example, Oakland's San Antonio district is one of the most ethnically diverse parts of the city, and it has a very dense population. But BART trains run nearly 3 miles through this area with only a single stop. By contrast, Walnut Creek and Pleasant Hill are much less diverse and only half as dense, but they have stations less than 2 miles apart. Racism is often built into the very structure of transportation systems. For example, transit agencies that serve white suburbs are often separated from those that serve the more diverse inner city. For example, the Atlanta metropolitan area is made up of 5 counties. 3 of these have a majority of African American residents, which are served by an entirely different transit agency than the one that serves the 2 white suburbs in the north. A similar situation exists in Detroit, where suburban buses won't even pick up city residents. But even if we accept the fact that our transportation system is shaped by racial and racist factors, there remains the question of what to do about it. After all, the interstate highway system has been built. Much of the damage has been done. The next video will explore what is being done to address some of these issues.